As front-end developers, what we do is we make layouts, we make grids. However, for the past decade, I've been making websites without using CSS Grid. At first it didn't exist, and then I thought Flexbox was fine. Maybe you think the same. Today I want to take you through one of these layouts that we create pretty often. A layout that looks like this. It's an article layout. Article layout where you have a top image that spans the full width, title of the article that's a little bit wider than the body. By the way, all the images and text are generated by AI. You should really read this. And then we keep continuing and you see a full screen image gallery again and center text and a 75% width image. These layouts are fun to make. I always enjoy making them. And I've always done this with Flexbox, or at least without CSS Grid. Let me show you how this is created right now and how I think you can make this so much better by using CSS Grid that you will never go back anymore. Let's take a quick look at the current code we have. This is written in Tailwind, by the way, but the example with CSS Grid I'm going to give you is plain CSS, so you can definitely apply this in every project you're working on. If we're building a layout like this, what we usually do is we create some sort of container div. And that container div is this div that contains everything. And in there you see I've set the max width and I've also added a margin X of auto, which means that the div is centered. And if we then look at this div inside of our page and we quickly open up the inspector, then you see also that this div is centered in the center of the page and there's elements in the layout that expand beyond that wrapper. So the approach that's most of the time taken is the following. For example, let's take a look at this main image. What you do is you make this image, for example, the width of the screen, so 100 viewport width. Then you give it a left of 50% and you give it a translateX of minus 50%, and that simply pulls it out of that grid. And that works, but it's just a bit of a hassle. Not only that, there's one big pitfall with using 100 viewport width as well. And that issue you aren't seeing right now because you're looking at how most Mac users see the website. However, if you're using a Windows machine or have a mouse connected to your Mac, you see a horizontal scroll bar. And that's one of the biggest downsides of using 100 viewport width. So this has always been a solution that had quite some struggles with it. So let me show you today a way to do this with CSS Grid that you will like and will never get rid of anymore. Ha. So first, what we need to do is we can remove quite a lot of code. I'm going to remove all of those viewport width units. So the text is just the size of the container we have placed it within. And then you see this is just a regular contain div. What I'm also going to do though is I'm going to get rid of the max width and also the margin X of auto, so everything is just the width of the screen. First, we are gonna make that container that we had display grid. And then I'm gonna hop over to my style sheet where we are gonna add a new custom class. And that class is gonna be called article grid. And in that class, we're gonna define grid template columns and then make it one fraction, 720 pixels and one fraction. And this on its own doesn't do anything yet. However, we can do a few things. First, we can name these columns. We can add in front of here content start and at the end content end. And what that does is it will create a slot that has a specific name, a column that has a name called content. So not content start or end, but content. And we define the boundaries with these square brackets and using start and end, which are kind of reserved names, to indicate where the start and end of that column is. And what we can now do to center the content again, like we used to have, is write article grid, and then we do a star selector, so we select every element in there, and then we say grid column content. And if we then go back to the HTML, we're gonna add the article grid class as well. And then you see everything is centered again. However, it now is not centered because there is a max width on here, because if we inspect this element, then you see that the grid div still has its full width. However, you see that there's 3 columns where that center column now is a fixed width of 720 pixels. what if we want to extend, for example, the top image to the full width? Well, we could create a class article grid and then, for example, name it full bleed, which is a name from typography if something spans the full width, but you could also just name it full width if you want that. And then we can give this a specific column here as well. And that column, I'm gonna make full width or full. And we're gonna define that inside of our template columns as well. So now we say everything that's at the very end of the grid, so at the end of the one fraction on both sides, will be called full. So we can then give this a name of grid column full. And if we then go back to our, for example, image, we can say full bleed, and look at that. It just expands the full width without us needing to do any 100 viewport width or any weird classes that we would need, and especially weird translates that we would need to add. All of a sudden, you can just pull things out and make it the full width simply by defining a few columns. And one thing to note here is that we have set this star selector as the default grid column to all of its direct children. That means that every item that's placed inside the grid will be automatically placed inside that content column. So that's why we don't need to create a bleed class or something like that for all of the items, because simply that's the default we have set. And now you're thinking, okay, and what if we, for example, want to have a little bit of a wider bleed, but not full bleed, specifically for example, the title? Well, for that, we can expand the template columns. We could, for example, add a wide start in here and say that that has an additional 140 pixels. And then we go to the end where we also say there's 140 pixels, and then we have the wide end. That way you see that there is a fraction, then 140 pixels, there's 720 in the center, and then again 140. So that means now that if we would go to the article grid and make, for example, a wide bleed, then we can now give this a grid column of wide. You're currently seeing a scroll bar here, but that's because we didn't implement responsive behavior yet. We'll fix that in a minute as well. But first, let's just add this wide class to the main title. We can simply now add wide bleed, and it will be wider, but not as wide as the image would be if we, for example, would extend this. Then you all of a sudden see that the title is pretty nice. It's a little bit wider than the main body content, but only the top title extends. And we can even go to this grid, for example, that's now still in the grid. We could just add a wide bleed, perhaps, and it would be wider. And of course, you could also make it a full bleed, and that way you could easily tweak it. And perhaps you could even make this an option in the CMS that all of these components can have either a specific bleed class to define the position in the grid. And I think doing it like this is so much more powerful and so much more flexible, especially, than using the translate and negative left offsets or translates. So there's only one thing left now, and that's that responsive behavior. How would you make this responsive? Because most of the time, if you look at this grid, what you probably want is you just want to have everything right underneath each other. Because if you go smaller, then there is no space left to put things outside of the grid. Everything just flows nicely together. Well, what you need to do is you need to override these columns, because we've set specific widths in here, and as soon as you go smaller, then it would just flow outside of the window because it will keep that width. You could make it percentages, things like that. You could also use min-max, but I think adding a simple media query is just the way to go here. Let's first add a add media screen and max width of 1000 pixels. And why 1000 pixels? That is because if you add these up, the 720 and 140s, you get to 1000. So that way, as soon as there is no space anymore outside of these fixed widths, it will go to the mobile view. What we then need to do is we need to override these grid template columns so we can remove those fixed widths. So let's select the article grid again and then define grid template columns, where we, for example, say 18 pixels, one fraction, and 18 pixels. What you see is I removed all of these named columns, because instead of putting them on a single row, I want to put them underneath each other. And for that, we're going to need grid template areas. And what I can then do is I can define that specific columns again. So we could say content full as well as white. And instead of putting them as columns next to each other, I've now rotated it 90 degrees and put them as rows right underneath each other. And then you might be wondering, what's that dot? That dot is actually also a name, but in this case, it's a common practice to use as a name for something you're not interested in. We don't want to position anything in there. So you can ignore those dots, but you need to name these columns so CSS Grid knows where to position all of these elements. Because by doing this, it suddenly on mobile will put all of the content right underneath each other. Because have a look. If we go smaller, you see that everything is put underneath each other, and we also have the 18 pixels on the outside. And we could even say, okay, I like it if the full width is still the full width and there is no spacing on the side, for example, for that top image. Then you can just remove those dots and it will make sure that it extends the full width. Isn't that just super powerful? With only adding these few clauses in there, it becomes so easy to change and position all of these elements. And then one question you might have is, now we've put these different columns underneath each other. Does the browser maintain some sort of space for all of these rows that are now underneath each other? Well, kind of yes, it does. But all of them have 0 pixel in height if there is no content in it. So even if there's like 5 blocks coming after each other that are all placed in the content, it will simply put them right underneath each other and there won't be any issue because they all have 0 pixels in height. So that's why this is an easy way to make your column-based layout suddenly row-based layout without having any impact in here. The only thing I still want to change is go back to our article grid and change this space Y to a gap Y. So we just use the grid gap instead of Tailwind's custom space utility. And I also think 8 is way too big. Let's just make it 6. Yeah, so that already looks so much better. And of course, you could decide that you give all of these blocks specific margin like you would do usually in CSS, but for now, adding in this gap, at least for this illustrative purposes, looks a little bit better than have everything stacked to each other and saves me from needing to write even more styles. But that's really all there is to it. If you create this custom grid, you suddenly can use these bleed classes to put everything in the place you want without needing to do any weird translations. And to me, that's really the default that I use nowadays when creating a specific grid layout, an article grid layout, instead of doing all these weird tricks. And you can add as many columns in here as you would want. So let me know if you've used this in a really specific place as well and are proud of the result, because I'm really curious to see what you are able to do with this. If you like this video, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel, and then I hope to see you in the next video.